Eyewitnesses say armed soldiers are going door to door in occupied parts of Ukraine to collect votes for so-called referendums on joining Russia. At the United Nations General Assembly, Russia's foreign minister has accused the West of stirring up tensions around the world.
West is introducing dividing lines everywhere along the lines of a confrontation between blocs. You are either with us or against us. There is no third option.
A British man captured by Russian forces in Ukraine and kept in solitary confinement for 5 months speaks for the first time about his ordeal.
In my cell, it was a two-man cell, but there it was like for 4 people because we had to sleep on the same bed on like some mat that was like infested with lice.
Reports from Ukraine say armed soldiers have been going door to door in occupied parts of the country to collect votes for self-styled referendums on joining Russia. Russian state media says door-to-door voting is necessary for security reasons. These are the 4 areas where voting is being held. They include occupied parts of Luhansk and Donetsk in the east and Zaporizhia and Kherson in the south, and they cover around 15% of Ukraine's territory. The so-called referendums have been widely condemned. President Biden described them as a sham and a false pretext to try to illegally annex parts of Ukraine. Our Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse reports from Kyiv.
Russia's version of their so-called referendums, a free and fair democratic process where Ukrainians in Kherson decide whether they want to join Russia. But on the same spot today, in the city centre, it's deserted. Ukrainian officials have posted footage like this. Apparently ballots being taken door to door with the support of armed men. On this unverified CCTV clip, a man is asked what apartment he's from. I don't live here. Are you sure? Yes, he says. He carries on down without looking over his shoulder. We've spoken to several people under Russian occupation. Hi, including Natalia. Not her real name. Nice to hear you too. A producer has voiced her words. What are your friends and family thinking about this? Do they want to go and vote?
All of my friends are against the referendum because we're sure that the referendum will be rigged. We don't understand why we should answer the question that is written in the ballots. We don't want to be part of Russia.
Driven by losses on the battlefield and growing criticisms back home, the Kremlin wants to legitimize its presence in Ukraine, while threatening an escalation if Ukraine keeps pushing back. This isn't about democracy, it's a move straight out of the Russian playbook. The result will be what Russia needs it to be, and Ukraine is calling on the world to see right through it. James Waterhouse, BBC News in Kyiv.
Well, one Kherson resident has been telling the BBC about the situation there. He says it's tense and he's afraid to go outside.
I saw some reports, I saw information on various channels and the social media that Russian soldiers are walking and knocking at the doors. They are already walking in the Kherson, but quite plenty reports coming from the villages as well. And the reports are varying from village to village. Some of them, they are not so rude, but in some villages, if people refuse to vote, they are threatened that they have to leave their homes within 24 hours. Otherwise, they will face bitter consequences. Nobody has knocked at my door, and I will not explain how, but I made everything possible so nobody will reach my door. I plan to continue staying here, but my plans may change at any moment. At any moment, everything depends on the situation, and everything is changing every day.
Human rights groups say that more than 700 people have been arrested at anti-war demonstrations across Russia since reservists were called up to fight in Ukraine. This video footage has emerged which appears to show a fight in the Russian city of Omsk between men drafted to the army and local police. The footage appears to show Russian police trying to force the men onto buses, according to the Reuters news agency journalist who shared the video. President Putin has announced a call-up of around 300,000 Russians who've done compulsory military service. The video, which has been attributed to the Omsk Civil Association, has not been verified by the BBC. There are reports of queues of thousands of cars trying to cross into Georgia from Russia. Earlier, I spoke to Sandro Jafalakiani, the journalist at this US-funded Radio Free Europe based in Tbilisi, and he started by updating me on the situation at that border.
We don't know how many Russians crossed the border since September 21, but what we see is every day hundreds of cars coming from Russia to Georgia. We see lots of people who are fleeing their country, fleeing the mobilization, but we don't have official statistics from Georgian government. What we know from Russian side, that 2,300 cars were waiting in the line, so it could be up to 10,000 people. So, as I told you, Georgian government provided no information, and they said 2 days ago that nothing special is happening. But we see different situation on the border when lots of Russian citizens are trying to get to Georgia.
And tens of thousands of Russians have come over in the months since the war started, haven't they? There have been protests, pro-Ukraine protests in Tbilisi, haven't there? How do people feel about the Russians coming over?
The reaction of society is mixed, but many of them have a negative reaction because Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And now they say Putin can invade once again, and saying he wants to defend Russian citizens, for example, who are here. But most of Russian citizens, we can say, who were fleeing Russia after February and in March, they were against war, they were against Putin. And they are supporting Ukraine.
At the moment, Russians who come over to Georgia are able to go without a visa and can stay for a year. Are there calls for that to be changed?
Yes, some opposition parties, NGOs, and some citizens are. They want visa regime to be imposed, but government is telling that no visa regime is going to be imposed. So at the moment, they can come here without any visa and stay up to 1 year.
Well, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has been addressing delegates at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Here's some of what he had to say.
Crises are growing, and the situation in the area of international security is deteriorating rapidly. The West is introducing dividing lines everywhere along the lines of a confrontation between blocs. You are either with us or against us. There is no third option possible. There are no compromises.
Well, our North America correspondent Neda Tawfik told me that Mr. Lavrov used his UN speech to accuse the West of hysteria over its actions in Ukraine.
Remember that the West has really been saying that the war in Ukraine is an attack on the very foundations of the world order, formed after World War II to put a focus on diplomacy, to make it so that no country could invade its neighbor and take land by force. This issue of sovereignty, territorial integrity, that again, the West says is so important to the current world order. Well, here we heard from the foreign minister of Russia saying that, yes, international security is deteriorating rapidly. It's a dramatic moment that the future of the world order is being decided today, but blaming the United States. He said that the United States saw themselves as a self-proclaimed masters of the world. And we saw in that clip there him talking about these dividing lines that he claimed the West, especially on Ukraine, was telling the world, you're either with us or against us. So we're hearing kind of very similar talking points from Russia. Russia that we've heard really throughout this crisis, claiming that they launched what they call this special military operation, which in reality, as we know, is the invasion of its neighbor Ukraine, because they believed on one hand that NATO was encroaching upon its borders and threatening its security. He repeated that here today. And again, repeating this idea that Ukraine in the east, that Russia was just trying to protect ethnic Russians there. So a really, I think, predictable speech here from the Russian foreign minister, given Russia's long expressed views about this, but certainly very interesting to see the newest comments here about the current referendums being held. He accused the West of being hysterical about that, throwing a fit about these referendums, and again saying it was Russia defending ethnic Russians in that region.
In other news today, Ukraine's President Zelensky has accused Russia's Vladimir Putin of sending his own citizens to their death in Ukraine.
He made the comments as huge queues, as you can see there, built up on Russia's borders, created by people trying to leave the country to avoid being called up to fight. Long lines of cars, as you can see, forming on the borders with Georgia, Kazakhstan and Mongolia too.
Meanwhile, a British man who's been freed from prison after being held by Russian-backed forces in Ukraine says he was treated worse than a dog and feared he would be killed.
Well, he was speaking to The Sun on Sunday. His name is Aidan Aslin, and he was one of those released with 4 other Britons earlier this week. And he told how he was beaten, kept in solitary confinement for 5 months, and even stabbed by a Russian officer. Simon Jones has this report.
We're now out of the danger zone.
The flight that took Aidan Aslin to his freedom after months in captivity, where he said he was treated worse than a dog.
In my cell, it was a 2-man cell, but there it was like for 4 people because we had to sleep on the same bed on like some mat that was like infested with lice. We also had to like sing the Russian national anthem like every morning, and if you didn't sing it, like you would get punished for it. You could get beaten, or they would punish you some way or another.
Aidan Aslin moved to Ukraine 4 years ago and had joined the Ukrainian armed forces.
If you're watching this, it means that we've surrendered.
But his unit was forced to surrender in April. He was held with other prisoners by Russian-backed separatists. In Donetsk, he said interrogation by a Russian officer almost cost him his life.
He got down on his knees and he was like smoking a cigarette, like, and he was like, "Do you know who I am?" And I was like, "No." And he says like, I'm your death," basically in Russian. I saw myself, I'd been stabbed, so I knew there's a very high possibility that I'm about to be killed.
Now freed in a deal brokered by Saudi Arabia between Russia and Ukraine, Aidan Aslin says he's amazed to be back home and among people who don't want to hurt him. Simon Jones, BBC News.